Nelson Mandela was the one who led South Africa in his freedom struggle against the apartheid system. For that, he was punished, spied upon, defamed, and imprisoned for nearly 3 decades. But this could not break him, and eventually, he became South Africa's first black president. However, shocking claims have emerged now that raise questions like whether Nelson Mandela was a sellout. In other words, people doubt whether Nelson Mandela used South Africa's freedom struggle for his own gains, violating the principles and ethics he advocated. In this, CIA letters, reports, and statements of the CIA agents have emerged. So, what is the reality? Let's find that out in this video because this truth has to be known at all costs. Let's get started. Nelson Mandela became a global leader and an inspiration for many. His freedom struggle for South Africa had earned him respect. However, in the Western world, people loved him in return for something they wanted. Not only the people of the West, but also their leaders expected Nelson Mandela to consider their enemies as his own enemies. That's where the problem lay. When Nelson Mandela was released from jail, he met with Yasser Arafat 3 times, praising him and showing his full support for the Palestine cause. He even expressed shared views and applause to Gaddafi. Even Mandela lauded Fidel Castro as a human rights leader, claiming that Cuba surpasses all others in this aspect. The West wanted Nelson to hate and go against all these leaders. Yet, sitting right in the United States during an interview, Nelson Mandela boldly said that we cannot and will never do that. We have our own struggles that we are pursuing. While we value the world's support for our cause, we remain an independent organization with our own policies. The stance of every country toward us is determined by its attitude toward our struggle. In other words, leaders who are friendly toward South Africa's fight for freedom will be considered friends of South Africa, no matter what the Western countries think about them. In his historical interview, Nelson Mandela said that Yasser Arafat, Colonel Gaddafi, and Fidel Castro supported South Africa's struggle. Therefore, there's no reason for South Africa to hesitate in acknowledging their commitment to human rights, as demanded in South Africa. Mandela said that our position is solely based on the fact that they actively support the anti-apartheid struggle. It's not merely rhetorical support. They provide resources for us to succeed in this fight. That is our stance. Mandela said that despite the ongoing negotiations, apartheid persists, and our people continue to be killed by the police, a distressing trend that has endured over the years. Vigilante groups openly arm themselves with the explicit intention of targeting progressive groups and leaders. The right wing also openly arms itself, claiming to do so to undermine the African National Congress, and even calling for harm to some of them. Mandela argued that at this point, South Africa needed support from any country on the planet. When black South Africans were being killed, pushed to corners, and deprived of their rights, leaders like Yasser Arafat, Muammar Gaddafi, and Fidel Castro offered support. Therefore, for South Africa, they were allies, not the Western countries, who remained silent and even supported the apartheid system in South Africa. This is not Mandela going against his principles, but creating them and defining them well. Therefore, when Mandela was asked to condemn or criticize Gaddafi, Castro, or Yasser Arafat, he clearly said that South Africa did not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. However, the Western countries, in their colonial mindset, believe that there is a degree of immorality in suggesting that the actions of leaders like Gaddafi in Libya or Castro in Cuba are irrelevant to human rights as long as they support the ANC. Mandela said that we are a liberation movement fully engaged in a struggle to free our people from one of the worst racial tyrannies the world has ever seen. We simply do not have the time to delve into the internal affairs of other countries. It is unreasonable for anyone to assume that this is our policy. Mandela said that he had been asked to express an opinion on the differences occurring within the USA, and the person making the request had clearly stated his position that there is racialism in this country. That's when Mandela showed his cards. He asked that the West not want him in the internal affairs of the United States, while simultaneously expecting him to engage in the internal affairs of Libya and Cuba. That's hypocrisy. Then Mandela categorically said that he supported Palestine, Yasser Arafat, and the PLO, because like South Africans, they are fighting for the right to self-determination. He further clarified that the support for Yasser Arafat's struggle does not cast any doubt on the ANC about the right of Israel to exist as a state. However, Mandela said that he does not endorse Israel retaining territories conquered from the Arab world, such as the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. Mandela said that one challenge we face globally is dealing with individuals who view problems not objectively, but through the lens of their self-interest. This complicates matters because reaching an agreement becomes exceedingly difficult when a person lacks objectivity. A prime example is the notion that Arafat's struggle against Israel necessitates condemnation. Mandela clarified that we cannot endorse such a stance. Mandela had said that it would be a significant error for us to shape our stance towards Yasser Arafat solely based on the interests of the Jewish community. Yet South Africans empathize with the struggles of the Jewish people and their historical persecution. The Jewish communities in South Africa displayed a lack of racialism. In political trials where few lawyers were willing to defend black South Africans, Jewish lawyers stepped forward. However, that doesn't mean the enemies of Israel are automatically our enemies, Mandela said. We react taking such a position. Whether you call it a political or moral question, anyone who alters their principles based on whom they are dealing with cannot effectively lead a nation. He then asked why the Western leaders were so insistent that he should involve himself in the internal affairs of Cuba and Libya. Mandela asserted that he had always been open to addressing any doubts the Jewish leaders may have about his stance. He said he was prepared to alleviate their concerns because they are a significant community in South Africa and the United States. He was ready to resolve any differences, but they must understand South Africa's position. Arafat was a comrade in arms. Some U.S. leaders like Senator Boren even supported Nelson Mandela in his stance, saying that the American people understand South Africa's situation. He said that the U.S. has seen families divided based on race, the denial of voting rights due to race, and people detained without a trial because of race. In the form of Nelson Mandela, we saw the evolution of a man who adjusted to situations. Both his supporters and enemies gave him titles. Therefore, some of them were true, but some aimed to defame him. It's because he had ideologies that often hurt the West, but simply, Mandela did not care. Nelson Mandela has undergone various transformations in the eyes of the South African public and the global community. He has played diverse roles, being labeled a terrorist, a freedom fighter, a struggle icon, a negotiator, a statesman, and a politician on the public stage, both in South Africa and worldwide. As a founding member of the African National Congress Youth League, Mandela was part of a group that consistently pushed the ANC toward more radical positions. His swift rise in the ranks during the 1940s made him a significant adversary to the apartheid government. Serving as Secretary General of the ANCL from 1948, Mandela became its leader and the public face of the Defiance campaign at its inception. Consequently, he emerged as the face of the ANC and the struggle against the oppressive nationalist government. By 1952, Mandela was the president of the Transvaal ANC and national deputy president, but both he and President Albert Luthuli were banned, compelling them to operate secretly. During this period, Mandela was perceived as a political opponent of the apartheid government, following a policy of nonviolent resistance. However, as the government intensified its oppression, the ANC shifted to violent resistance, transforming Mandela's image from a political opponent to a freedom fighter, or, in the eyes of the apartheid government, a terrorist. In the early 1960s, Mandela drew the attention of the apartheid government's secret police, earning the nickname Black Pimpernel. He thwarted the efforts of the secret police to halt his underground resistance activities, leading to his military training in Ethiopia and Morocco. Mandela became the commander of the newly formed MK, the ANC's armed wing. Initially viewed as a troublemaker by nations supporting the nationalist government, his label escalated to that of a terrorist in the 1960s. This perception was influenced by the ANC being branded a terrorist organization by the United States and the United Kingdom due to its ties with communism in China and the Soviet Union. That's something only a few people know about today. On the one hand, the West wanted Mandela to condemn what the West perceived as its enemies, but on the other hand, they were labeling his party as a terrorist organization. The US and UK viewed the apartheid government as a barrier against communism, supporting the banning of opposition parties. Mandela's fame was confined to intelligence services and the South African struggle movement, leading to his inclusion on a CIA terrorist watch list, a status he held until 2008. However, Mandela was not a prominent global figure at that time. Following Mandela's arrest and the subsequent Rivonia trial, he transitioned from being the sole leader to one among a group. One could argue that Mandela's impactful speech from the dock, declaring "I am prepared to die," set in motion a process that ultimately elevated him to one of the most famous and idolized leaders globally. Despite being part of a group during his imprisonment, Mandela's international perception transformed. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Free Mandela campaigns, primarily driven by the anti-apartheid movement, gained momentum in various countries. This shift indicated that, in the eyes of the public, Mandela now symbolized something distinct from his previous portrayal as a terrorist. His celebrity had grown, diverting attention from his militant past and emphasizing his victimhood at the hands of the apartheid government. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Even fellow prisoners, such as Mac Maharaj, seem to acknowledge Mandela's rising celebrity status, assisting him in smuggling the initial draft of his autobiography out of Robben Island prison. An editorial titled Mandela, Man, Legend, and Symbol of Resistance by Alan Cowell for the New York Times in 1985 reflects on how Mandela was perceived while incarcerated, both internationally and locally. He writes that the enigma, however, seems to be that, invisible and unheard, removed by white authority from Black political activism, Mr. Mandela has captured the spirit and devotion not only of those who knew him at the time of his incarceration, but also of those who have, in the last year of upheaval, assumed the custodianship of Black resistance, the teenagers who were not yet born when he was jailed. When Mandela emerged from prison in 1990, he did so as a largely messianic figure for both the South African and international public. However, the South Africa he re-entered was on the brink of widespread violence, with the 1980s and early 1990s witnessing a significant surge in political unrest. As Mandela embraced freedom, the world watched anxiously as South Africa teetered on the edge of civil war. Lwando Zaso, a lawyer who lived through the tumultuous 1980s and 1990s, vividly describes the violence during this period, highlighting the drastic escalation and the toll it took on the nation. The massacres at Boipatong and Bisho in 1992, claiming the lives of 72 Black South Africans, added pressure to the negotiations between the ANC and NP. This led to the signing of the Record of Understanding between Mandela and F.W. de Klerk in September, marking a pivotal moment during a time of escalating violence. Despite the challenges, Mandela's quest for a lasting peaceful solution and the cessation of violence faced unfair judgment as he navigated the complexities of a nation going through war and peace with the weight of overwhelming responsibility on his shoulders. Mandela faced considerable criticism for being labeled a sellout, a perception largely rooted in the belief that he single-handedly drove the negotiations. This perception emerged from Mandela's prominent role in the anti-apartheid movement and his assumption of the presidency in 1991 within the African National Congress. Despite the negotiations between the ANC and the NP involving multiple participants over many years, Mandela, as the outspoken representative of the ANC at the time, was perceived as the one in charge. Throughout his presidency, Mandela meticulously shaped a public image that represented reconciliation and rainbow nationalism. This image gained global recognition, exemplified by his joint receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize with F.W. de Klerk in 1993. Coined by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the concept of the Rainbow Nation aimed at post-apartheid nation building by celebrating South Africa's diverse cultures. Mandela actively supported this vision through initiatives like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in 1995, emphasizing restorative justice over punitive measures. Another noteworthy aspect of Mandela's public persona was the presentation of the 1995 Rugby World Cup trophy in South Africa. Held a year after Mandela's election, the predominantly white Springboks secured victory. In a symbolic gesture of reconciliation, Mandela took to the field donning a Springbok jersey, a symbol of the apartheid era, and handed the trophy to Captain Francois Pienaar. This moment became an icon, symbolizing a pinnacle in the belief of post-apartheid, nation-building. After Mandela withdrew from public life, he garnered widespread praise worldwide. He continued to be hailed as a great leader and served as a symbolic figurehead for the ANC. In a noteworthy 2009 ANC rally, Mandela appeared alongside Jacob Zuma, who was then contesting for the presidency. This moment was crucial, showcasing the political capital retained by the former president and the legitimacy Zuma gained from their association. Zuma would later go on to become president of both the ANC and South Africa. Mandela became a valuable political asset in South Africa, evident in his participation in various events, including the closing ceremony of the 2010 Soccer World Cup held in the country. Even the political opposition in South Africa invoked Mandela's public persona for political legitimacy. For instance, in a 2017 call for a vote of no confidence in President Jacob Zuma, Democratic Alliance leader Mmusi Maimane referred to Mandela's legacy, suggesting that Mandela would have voted against Zuma. Today, South Africa follows Nelson Mandela's legacy and supports Palestine unlike any other country. It's because of the parallels between South Africa's historical struggles against the apartheid system and the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestine. Mandela's commitment to justice, human rights, and anti-colonial movements has profoundly influenced South Africa's approach to global issues, specifically emphasizing the Palestinian cause. The connection between the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the Palestinian struggle is crucial. Mandela, a fervent advocate for freedom and equality, drew comparisons between the oppression experienced by Black South Africans under apartheid and the challenges faced by Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. He consistently expressed solidarity with the Palestinian cause, emphasizing the imperative for international support to alleviate the injustices confronting the Palestinian people. The historical context of South Africa's triumph over apartheid has significantly impacted the country's foreign policy, fostering empathy and shared experiences with nations undergoing similar struggles. Many perceive both the apartheid regime in South Africa and the Israeli occupation of Palestine as instances of systemic oppression and discrimination, further reinforcing the moral alignment between Mandela's legacy and South Africa's support for Palestine. Nelson Mandela's grandson, Nkosi Zwelivelile Mandela, says that Israel's advocates, both in South Africa and worldwide, have portrayed his grandfather as a liberal pacifist who benevolently made peace with his enemies. Distilling Rolihlahla, which is Nelson Mandela's middle name, meaning the uprooter, life into that of a peacemaker and reconciler is a deliberate distortion of his legacy. President Mandela embodied his middle name. He was a revolutionary, intellectual, and freedom fighter, dedicating his life to resisting oppression and restoring dignity. It is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and nonviolence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks, Mandela warned in May 1961, 7 months before assuming command of the newly formed armed wing of the African National Congress, ANC, called Spear of the Nation. However, when Israel's supporters discuss Nelson Mandela, they exclusively highlight his message of dialogue and reconciliation. Consequently, the narrative of Madiba, as he was known, and South Africa's transition to democracy has been simplified into a fairy tale of forgiveness rather than a long, hard, often angry chronicle of justice and freedom. Dialogue, forgiveness, and reconciliation must be reinstated in their proper context and place in the history of Mandela's story and South Africa. Mandela's cause was not peace and reconciliation. It was justice and liberation. Reconciliation and forgiveness only followed after liberation was achieved. Before that, Mandela considered any form of reconciliation with the oppressor as submission and a tool of co-option to dull the liberation movement. South Africa's allies in the global anti-apartheid movement never urged South Africa to make peace with its oppressors before its liberation was achieved. Asking South Africans to engage in dialogue with the apartheid government within the context of a brutal police state characterized by relentless dispossession, restrictions on freedom of movement, violent crackdowns on protest, and detention without trial, was equivalent to urging it to collaborate with our oppressors. The world never asked or expected this of South Africans, yet it is demanded of Palestinians who live under the same, if not worse, conditions. Mandela the Forgiver is particularly admired by Israel's advocates. They relish recounting how he earned the trust of his enemies and had tea with Betsy Verweerd, the widow of apartheid's architect, Hendrik Verwoerd. Israel's apologists want the world to believe that as soon as Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was released, he abandoned the armed struggle and quietly entered into negotiations with the apartheid government, having no demands or preconditions. But this is not the reality. On the day he was released from prison, Nelson Mandela said, "The factors which necessitated the armed struggle still exist today. We have no option but to continue. We express the hope that a climate conducive to a negotiated settlement will be created soon, so that there may no longer be the need for the armed struggle." Isn't it true that the Western media is still continuing its dirty campaign against Nelson Mandela? What do you think can be the possible reason behind defaming Nelson Mandela? Is it to take away from South Africans their hero, whom they respect and love? Let us know your thoughts on whether you agree with Nelson Mandela's stance that their enemies are not our enemies. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.